Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Beyond Waste podcast from CIWM. I'm your host, Lee Marshall, and I'm the Director of Innovation and Technical Services here at CIWM. And I'm pleased to say it's a proper CIWM podcast today because I'm joined by the current President of CIWM, Tim Walker. Hello, Tim.
Hi, how are you, Lee?
No, I'm not too bad, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, very well. It's past midweek and the sun was shining recently, so yeah, it's lovely.
Good. Now, Tim is coming towards the end of his presidential year, so we thought it'd be a good idea to catch up with him and have a bit of a recap about how the year's gone, how he's found it, and maybe some sort of thoughts and hopes for the future. So maybe we'll start with the CIWM AGMs, Tim, because that's something that the president does each year, and I think you've just finished those round of meetings, AGMs, as it were, across the whole 4 countries.
Yeah, I was very keen in my presidential year that I should get to each of the centre councils at least once. So I made a big effort to get around the 4 nations and Ireland to see everybody. So the last AGM was held on Tuesday for CIWM Midlands. And there was a really interesting session about AI and the role of AI going into the future in resources and waste management. But it has to be said, the one thing I've really been struck by in getting around to each of the different centres is how welcome everybody made me feel.
Yeah.
It was really striking. It was really welcoming. It was really open. And again, the one thing about waste is it's a very inclusive sector. Us wasters are a very welcoming lot. And we have an immediate base plate we can all talk about because we all have lots of experiences of waste, and they're always fascinating because we seem to invest a lot of ourselves into our jobs and into our appreciation and understanding of what we're doing. Or maybe that's just CIWM members.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, to be honest. I think my experience mirrors yours. You know, the waste sector is a very welcoming one. I think especially then on top of that, CIWM members, because they're even more invested in it than your average waster, if there is such a thing. True.
I mean, there's been some great visits. There've been great site visits. There's been great talks throughout. Getting a refresh on latest thinking around waste, around landfilling. I mean, I must admit, I'd kind of mentally closed the book on landfilling, but there's still a lot of innovation going on it, all the way through to some of the really recent developments around circular economy and how it too is featuring. And I suppose the issue is, both for me, but also for my successors coming after, both as president, but also in the trustee board, is how do we begin to assimilate more clearly that transition? And it feels really weird talking about that because in waste management terms, every year is a new year. It's an area where we're constantly learning and constantly refreshing our knowledge and updating our knowledge because no 2 years are the same. And so we take it as a given for anybody who's been involved in the sector for any length of time that there is this ongoing change. And on a call I was on earlier today, it's kind of weird because just now it feels like we're in a bit of a lull. And it could be there's been just so many interventions and new policies dropped in the last sort of 2-3 years that what is this new normal is actually feeling a bit slower temporarily until we get the ETS coming out, until we get waste tracking coming out, until we get landfill bans coming, and all this other stuff. But at the minute, it feels just slightly slower, which is great. It's a chance to breathe and to do some reading.
It does actually give us a chance to pause for breath. And it's interesting you say that, actually, because thinking about it, actually, your presidential year has coincided with quite a lot of policy change, especially on the Westminster side of things. Obviously, we had the actual elections and a new government coming in. They've done a lot to sort of implement the resources and waste strategy policies that had sort of, ground to a bit of a halt. And then they're already taking the next steps in terms of the sort of circular economy task force and a circular economy strategy. So you're right. There's been a lot happening in your presidential period, hasn't there?
Yeah, and certainly it did feel, having launched the presidential report last June, it almost felt by the end of summer, with the new government beginning to enact and beginning to articulate its vision for the future, that the report itself was a bit almost outdated before it had even properly landed. Now, it has to be said, I think it stood up well, because as the discussion, as the framing of the circular economy has become more established and more, I suppose, explored further, the issue of design, that issue of exploring the full supply chain and seeing about the injects from the initial creation of product, or the phrase that I like in the actual report itself, stuff. How is stuff created? How do we manage stuff? What are we doing with stuff? Why are we wasting so much stuff? And that, I think, has begun to come through again in a way that is going to stand a bit better the test of time from my initial thoughts of, oh, it's already outdated within a couple of weeks of being published. But throughout the year, I've constantly gone back to it, and there are sort of aspects of the issue around design and the waste sector and how we interact one part of the supply chain with the other, which we've been exploring as a small subgroup. And I think there's some potential new developments around working potentially with the likes of the Design Council and others to see, is there a project here we can take forward to do something further with the report, to give it a bit more longevity. And there's even the prospect of a talk later on this year to the Design Council itself at their annual event to showcase us as wasters talking to designers around the importance of considering the makeup, the component parts of what they are designing earlier. I suppose that's one of the things that really struck me through the report this time last year, before it was finalized, and in the immediate aftermath of its publication, was how little scope or ability designers have to think around waste and the creation of waste when they're answering their design brief. They find themselves caught within very tight guardrails as to what they're expected to do. And for many of them, they had never really given much thought to what happens with this product that I'm designing at the end of life. And obviously the circular economy now holds a mirror up to that much more closely and says, you need to look at making products last longer. You need to look at making products that can be repaired, or you need to look at products as a service. And all that features in that design space, which I think it's really timely for that report to have been there. So I'm glad that it was able to contribute to our sector's evolution in its thinking.
I mean, was that a little bit of a worry for you when you actually published the report initially? Because I'm with you. When the report was coming together, it did feel a bit surprising that designers themselves didn't have as much, whatever the right word is, influence over design, which seems a bit strange. It's like, hang about, you're the designer, and yet you haven't got a lot of influence over the design. So, was that a little bit of a worry, or was that a bit of excitement in terms of actually here's something perhaps people haven't appreciated, and we can really firstly shout about, and then get into some discussions about with perhaps sectors we hadn't thought we would do that with?
I think it's a really good question. Certainly, I think I credited designers as having far greater agency than they actually have. In many cases, designers are small organizations or individuals, and they're responding to a client or a commissioning brief. So the reality is they have got very little opportunity to push back against their client and say, oh, but what you're producing won't last very long, or it'll cost slightly more, but it will last longer, or it'll look better, or it'll be recoverable and stuff. So as they are effectively just responding to that commission, they often have very little agency. Yeah. And so I think there is obviously a much more mature conversation that we can have as a sector, especially if we are incorporating and including our growing role in that circular economy space, to say there does need to be better conversations around resource use. There does need to be better conversations around the makeup, the composition, the complexity of the materials that you're combining together, because we need them to recover. And certainly now in the last year, you said my report came out at a particularly charged time for policy interventions. Yeah, look at the geopolitics. Look at the issues that have emerged in the course of the year over things like critical raw materials. And yet we're still junking huge amounts of of electrical product. And I think this year, the UK has the dubious honour of being the highest producer of electrical waste in the world, having taken over from Norway. So given that we're now wasting sizable amounts of electrical product in our kitchen drawers and everything else that are just either sitting there or that we dispose in our general residual waste, we need to be looking at how better to recover those items, all that palladium, all that tritium, all those other materials that we are just casually discarding.
And that's the thing, isn't it? Is you can look at it in terms of look at all this waste we're producing, or you could look at it in terms of look at all these resources we have the potential to collect and repurpose. And
yeah,
and
that's one of the interesting conversations I had on the landfill issue was, as there are very few people who are now moving into landfilling, how landfills are constructed and how they are maintained is a fading skill set.
Mm.
And yet, if we're going to move to a place where we are really looking at resource recovery, at which stage do we look at landfill mining?
Yeah.
And if landfill mining is effectively landfill re-engineering, where are those new skill sets? So maybe the skill sets we need are not purely and simply about always looking forward, but it may be about re-establishing and revisiting some of the skills that we thought were in the past, so that if the requirement comes that we do start looking at landfill reclamation, landfill mining better, we know how to disassemble landfill sites with minimal environmental impact.
I mean, that would be interesting from a skills point of view, wouldn't it? If you had people who spent some of their or most of their career up to a certain point working on the landfills to bury the stuff, and then you'd think they've got the skills and the knowledge to then help mine those landfills. So they could then end up, mining from the things that they help construct, which would be really interesting in a way.
Yeah. And in the process, you could also look at the issue of stabilizing the sites so they don't gas as much.
Mm.
There might be issues around chemical engineering, so you remove some of the PFAS and POP type material that's now being name-checked as being a problem from landfill sites, and you increase their level of inertedness so that they're more stable for building purposes on as well. So there are benefits that could come out of this longer term, but again, that's probably for another day.
Yeah, it probably is. But again, it shows, what you mentioned about, we've both been in this sector quite a while now, but it's not the same sector we both joined at all, is it? It's very different because, like you say, each year we're evolving, we're tackling different problems, and we're coming up with different solutions as a sector.
Well, General Tacitus back in the Roman times said a man cannot stand in the same river twice because it's not the same man, it's not the same river. And the waste sector has really been an example of that, because what we started out with in terms of old-fashioned dilute and dispersed landfill sites moving very rapidly into contained landfill sites, moving into the recycling agenda and the recycling era, and now moving beyond that, recognizing that recycling is actually not very good in terms of resource management because you're destroying the utility of the product. It has been a wonderful ride. And there's obviously lots more to go in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we'll touch on that probably when we talk about maybe the circular economy strategy and task force. But I mean, you've mentioned the report there and what it's about. And a bit like, just because you come to the end of your presidential year doesn't mean, that you suddenly fall off the edge of a cliff or something, because you're still part of the presidential team for another year. And I know it's something we're trying to do with presidential reports, is give them that really long tail. And you've become a member, and why wouldn't you, given the title of your report, but you've become a member of our resource efficient design specialist expert group. And I think that group are looking to take forward, hopefully, some of the aspects of your report, for another, it could be a year, 2 years, 3 years, who knows where we can get to with it. But yeah, hopefully that your involvement in that group can continue the work of the report and what it's highlighted.
It'd be great if it could, because it does feel in many ways like we're at the beginning of a conversation. One of the roles or one of the aspects I did before becoming president was I was involved quite closely with DEFRA's Advisory Committee on Packaging. Mm-hmm. And that was fascinating over the years I was part of that group, because it brought me into the room with the other people in the supply chain.
Yeah.
And while the presidential report, turning off the tap, less pruck colloquially, well, that focused on the design element, which was kind of seen as being the first stage, or one of the first stages in the supply chain, and waste and resources management is seen as the last stage in the supply chain. The reality is there's a whole range of intervening stages in that supply chain, which ACP opened my eyes to much more clearly than any book learning I had done.
Yeah.
So if the report has got relevance to the red group, then yeah, I think it's a good starting point. But it does sort of charge the members of the red group to actually say, how can we engage with the different sectors, the logistics sector, the distribution sectors, the retailers, wholesalers, manufacturing sectors, in a way that is beneficial, in a way that gives added weight and added substance to what they're seeking to do. And how do we contribute through that discussion towards the circular economy and delivering the circular economy, which is ultimately and has to ultimately be around waste minimization and using materials better for longer and recovering them at the end of the day in a more sustainable manner. And I use those words loosely, I know, but nevertheless, we do need to sort of recharge that whole engagement piece across the supply chain and not just be seen at the end. And the phrase I've used a few times over the year is the janitorial role, where we just sweep up after everybody.
Yeah, and I think that's where we're starting to get to as an organisation, in terms of when you think of the circular economy, actually our sector could be and is on the way to becoming the bedrock of the circular economy, because if we don't function in what we do, the circular economy is going to struggle to actually work, because we're the people ultimately who take things, the stuff, the proc, as you call it, that people say they don't want, and we get it to people who say they do want it. And like you've name checked in the past, that was, we take everything from everyone and stick it in a hole in the ground. And we're a much more intelligent system now in the way we deal with things and we deal with materials, in terms of how many people we get them off, how many containers they're in, how many end markets we feed. It's evolved a hell of a lot.
Well, we are gifted these huge tonnages, and it's almost 15 million tonne a year through the local authority waste streams. And the reality is, how do we stream those materials better? How do we collect and sort and segregate those materials better to reintroduce them into the supply chain in a way that they can be repeatedly recovered for reuse? And I suppose that raises a big spectre around, have we got the infrastructure to do that? Because that's going to require a whole range of new sheds, which is going to be all around not just the sorting and separation of these materials, but also potentially the storage of these materials for reuse and remanufacture, because we can't have everything in just in time. So we do need to look at the sort of the storage and cataloging and categorizing of these materials in a way that we can have access to them, maybe not in the immediate future. As I mentioned a minute ago, not everything can be just in time, but in a year's time or 2 years' time.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about infrastructure, a lot of the time, conversation immediately goes across to like ETS plants and things like that. But like I say, the infrastructure of the future is going to be around sorting, repairing, reuse. It's going to be a very different type of infrastructure than perhaps what we've been focusing on the last, 10, 15 years maybe.
And that immediately, as I'm speaking, rises in my mind Anna Willett's former president's paper on when is waste end of waste.
Yeah.
And what happens when it comes to regulating materials that are no longer considered to be waste? Because if these materials are going to be stored, they need to pass through some degree of categorization and assessment to declare that they are no longer waste. And that then changes how they are viewed and managed.
Exactly. And I mean, it's one of the reasons we had, when I mentioned the election earlier on, CIWM published 10 policy opportunities for whoever came in. And one of those was about better regulation. And not that we're saying regulation is poor, because it's not. We've got a whole raft of very professional people out there, but it's about regulating resources, whereas at the moment we regulate waste. And that chimes exactly with what you just said about Anna Willett's report. And how can we get regulation that actually regulates resources and helps keep it in economic use? And that's a tricky one to do.
It is, for sure. And there is that headset shift. I mean, you've been using the phrase for many years, talking about resources and waste, whereas waste comes secondary to resources.
Yeah.
How do we instill that as being a mindset that underpins the whole development of the circular economy? It's resources. Everything is resources. It's materials, it's commodities, it's stuff. Yeah. It's only waste at the very last, at the very final stage, when nothing further can be done with it. But ultimately, everything has got a value. Everything has got some commercial properties. Some may be positive, some may be negative. You may have to pay for some stuff, but likewise, you may get a revenue stream from other materials. But the big thing is going to be around the purity of the products. And as such, how do we achieve that? How do we engage with that across the sector in a way that is usable, in a way that is future-proofing, in a way that we showcase these materials to other manufacturers so that they want them and they prioritize them over primary materials, because there's where we've economically founded in the past. Yes. Because the price points of primary materials has obviously not included externalities. And now we're beginning to get into another paper that was produced over the year about EPR, extended producer responsibility beyond just packaging. One of the comments I will probably make in my final comments is I believe there should be an extended producer responsibility for every item placed on the marketplace, so that those costs are fully internalized. That would be a way to give designers agency, because it would mean that what they built into their products had real consequences. So I think that would be quite pivotal. I think it would also be very difficult to achieve in the current climate, but nevertheless, it would really begin to focus the minds of those commissioners and commissioning agents and big multiple brands, what they were asking, what they were expecting of the full supply chain.
Yeah, it starts to pose a very different question of the designer themselves, doesn't it? If those externalities are built into the brief, and for argument's sake, they're either top or second on their list of considerations, rather than maybe 8th, 9th, 10th, like they possibly are at the moment.
Yeah. And that's, as I said a few minutes ago, that's what really struck me, was designers were really very, very tightly conditioned into what they could do. They had very, very limited space to wriggle. I've got my arms got my elbows in tightly at the minute for that sort of that perspective of they're kind of hemmed in with what they can do. So they can't just say, you wanted, a new yogurt pot, but instead I've designed a dragon breathing chariot for you instead, because that's so much more fun. You don't get paid for that. You get paid for answering the brief you've been given.
And you could argue that's completely the opposite sometimes of politics, where you never answer the brief.
I couldn't possibly comment.
Absolutely. We've both been involved in politics too long to answer that sort of thing. I mean, apart from your report then, have there been any sort of key milestones in your year as president, or anything that sort of stood out to you then as you've gone through it?
I suppose one of the first things that I did was I got a chance to go to Ecomundo in Italy. Mm-hmm. And Ecomundo in Italy is one of those, I suppose, European-wide trade fairs showcasing the best of the sector. And for much of us in the UK and Ireland, we're familiar with the Resource and Waste Management exhibition in Birmingham in September time. Well, Ecomundo was substantially and significantly bigger. And it's an eye-opener to see how much further development has gone on in many of the European countries around that idea of separation and segregation,
Mm.
that idea of sorting, that idea of seeking to retain the utility of products and materials and to finesse them and to purify them and to restore them for useful use. I suppose another thing it shows to me is just how much money is put into the system to allow us to continue doing more of the same, which is locked onto that kind of whole linear economy focus.
Yeah.
Because ultimately, even though many of these technologies are useful and can be applied in a circular economy context, the lack of ability to articulate what that means more widely societally means that the prevailing viewpoint is it's still kind of linear. It's still kind of, I get something, I use something, and I throw it away. And we have, in some regards, over elevated the issue of recycling and saying, well, it's okay. We can do, well, because I'm doing recycling, I can still consume as much as I'm consuming, and I can still throw stuff away because I'm recycling it rather than junking it. And a few papers, even in the last month, are highlighting that's not the way to go. You're not going to recycle your way to a better future. We need to reset our relationship with stuff, how much stuff we have, how often we have stuff, what we do with it at the end of its useful life for us. And I think there is that kind of head shift required. And I think it's going to be really exciting to see what sort of role we have to play in that, both individually and collectively and sectorally.
So it's really interesting. So to a certain extent, the focus on recycling has got us so far. It's got us here, as it were. Now, yeah, all right, we probably, in some circumstances, want to be a bit further ahead than we are. But it's done a lot of good. But like you say, the next step isn't around recycling. It's around reuse, prevention, repair, etc. And like you say, it's an exciting thought to have, but also quite a difficult one, because at some point, us as individuals and the sector again are going to have to say, we know we said we needed to do all this recycling, but now we want you to do something different. And that initially could be a little bit of a hard sell, couldn't it?
I have no doubt it'll be tricky to do. And it does begin to bump up into the sort of the current economic thinking, because we hear governments talk about the need for growth and to resume growth. And in some regards, the inverse of growth is the production of byproduct and waste, because growth is about encouraging increased levels of productivity and consumption. And then we're saying, well, what is the outworking of consumption? It's waste. So if we're now saying, actually, we need to be more sensible about how we manage our supply chains, and we need to minimize waste. And again, that issue about waste minimization, waste prevention is kind of notable in that it's not framed in many of the government policies and interventions that we see at all levels. It's not the automatic default setting. So how do we engage in a way that is constructive? And you can see even in the last couple of days when Mr. Blair made comments about net zero being realistic. And even he flagged up society at large doesn't want to be told that they're going to have issues like consumption restricted. Yet ultimately, we bump into these issues about insanity, doing more of the same and expecting a different result. So there is a more complex and a more involved discussion to be had, both amongst ourselves and across the supply chain, and then more widely with society at large as to what we're seeking to achieve. And I suppose one of my realizations this year that's really sort of come to the fore is, in many regards, we're quite benign in accepting our badge as consumers. And yet ultimately, our primary role in society is not to be necessarily simply a consumer. It's to be a citizen.
Yes.
Which is that whole democratic process and that whole democratic right. But yet we're satisfied to allow ourselves to be badged in the retail space as simply consumers. And our job is merely to buy stuff. And then there is this channel shift goes on because we're presented with all this stuff, which we are then tasked with recycling. So I know there are court cases going on in America, and I've read articles in some of the newspapers in the last couple of days about a more radical form of intervention, where the producers of these materials are being represented with their product at the end of its perceived life, saying, I've used these bed sheets and they've worn out, they've stood me well, but I don't know what to do with them now, and they're not of a high enough grade to be recycled for textiles. So back to you.
Yeah.
You know, you, Mr. and Mrs. Retailer, you do something with it. Or, you know, some of the plastics are being name checked at the minute, saying there's been no material shift in the volume and recyclability of plastics over the last 10, 15 years, despite all the different packaging regs. And you're going, so this ongoing shift of responsibility from the producer to the consumer is effectively a known thing, that there are issues around it, yet it continues. And if anything, it's increasing. So this is where the insanity piece comes in.
Yeah.
We're doing more of the same and expecting a different result. Something in this mix has to change with our management of materials. And from our side and from my report side, turning off the tap was saying, surely some of the insanity is for us to continue to try and bail out the bathtub faster and faster and faster when the taps are still full on. That in itself is madness.
Yeah.
So why don't we turn off the taps? And interestingly, I've seen that phrase, turning off the tap, appear more and more frequently over the course of the year. Now, of course, it could be, but because I happen to use that as a title, that I've become sensitized to seeing it. But nevertheless, I have seen it in multiple different print media and online as various authors, various academics, various operators begin to say, there's too much stuff flowing into the system. Can we not just reduce its volume? Instead of having a fire hose of stuff coming at us, can we just moderate it a bit to give us a better chance to recover? And much of what we try to do on recycling is scotched or is prevented just by the sheer volume of materials we have. It'd be lovely if we had time on our hands to have the capacity to sort and separate everything out. But instead we have this fire hose of stuff locked on, full on all the time. And we don't have the opportunity to disaggregate, to collect, to withdraw the valuable elements from it because it's full open.
Yeah.
We have to deal with what we're presented with. Now, I know AI and machine learning and robotics may address some of that, but nevertheless, there is this question about, do we actually need to have so much stuff flowing at us all the time?
Yeah, and that actually, the flip side of that is there's a danger we just technology our way out of it, so that the stuff keeps coming through. It's just we can bail it out quicker, and it's really interesting what you say there. I mean, to a certain extent, you could argue the human race is where it is because we became citizens, because we cooperated, because we looked at the greater good rather than just consumed. And it does feel like there's some sort of conversation to be had about what does consumption and growth, what do they both mean in the future? Because there's the potential for growth if you look at it through a slightly different lens still, and a potential to redefine what consumption actually means going forward. And if we don't do that at any point, we're going to struggle to get the circular economy really going, aren't we?
Well, you're skating on thin ice now, I tell you. This is getting deep into some philosophical territory. But yeah, sort of some of the issues are about how capitalism and democracy became co-opted and conjoined, because there was obviously democracy far earlier than there was capitalism. And our current modes of production really only took off post-World War II. So the issues we're facing were not issues that our grandparents and great-grandparents faced. They are relatively modern. and obviously the big organizations and companies that were formed in that post-war era were designed to capitalize and magnify profitability. And so it's all linked together in a way that if we are resetting, there are some very big conversations to be had. But, they get to the heart of what the human condition is in many regards, which is around how we interface and interact one with the other. And that's been obscured in some regards with this focus on consumption. I'm not going to say any more on this because I feel this is probably an entire podcast in itself. And yeah, it's getting quite heavy.
It is, yeah. No, that's well done for bringing me back on track, and that's what I love about doing these podcasts. Is every time I do one, we end up having a phrase like that where, this could be a podcast in itself, or this could be a podcast in itself. And it just shows you what a rich and varied sector we work in, which is why we do it and why we keep doing it. But bringing it back in, let's focus back in your presidency then. Is there anything else that stood out to you this year on perhaps not quite as philosophical level?
I've really enjoyed meeting lots and lots of different characters, from the tire fitters I met in the Northwest to some of the issues around the new bin weighing technology and how it can be used to track efficiency of route optimization. Again, that was a conversation from the Northwest. To some of the other conversations in places like Ireland, hearing about the DRS scheme they've introduced there and how well it's going, but also then how it links into the MRF operations in Ireland. Yeah. Because obviously the DRS scheme is working in parallel to it and some of the issues around it. And there's issues in Ireland, again, with WE collection and how they've had that drop-off system put in place now for over 20 years for WE collection as effectively it rests on the householder. It's really interesting how that has been resourced and staffed up and how well it operates. There's been some great events in Scotland and seeing the sheer array of people now associated with the waste sector who are not just simply CIWM, but from a raft of other operators, the likes of the skip operators, the likes of health and safety in the sector. There were some great discussions around wood waste and issues like quench technology to avoid, spontaneous fires. I had some really nerdy conversations about coning and quartering for waste characterization, which I haven't had for 20 years. And it was great to revisit it. So I really enjoyed the opportunity to get out and about. Because I'm from a local government background, it has been quite testing, however, because for me, local is going to the next borough, the next council area. And so bouncing around the place from England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, Southern Ireland has certainly been quite testing in itself, as it's just not something that I have done for years. But as I said at the top of this discussion, I've really enjoyed getting out and about and meeting people. They've all been amazingly welcoming. And there's been some really, really good, top-notch personal engagement with the membership, but also some really interesting developments and hearing what's going on in the sector more widely.
Yeah. Oh, really good. And like I said, a lot of things, it can boil down to the people, can't it? Whatever industry you're in, whether you're in sports, volunteering, doesn't matter. A lot of the time it's about people, isn't it?
I was amazed by the side of the shed that was being used in the Northeast for the storage of plastic bags. And also the testing that's done in the Northeast by this particular provider to ensure that the bags you buy are up to standard. But I suppose the default of that then was how many bags come through to them that are not up to standard, that are substandard, that they effectively act as that quality check on behalf of their customers, that we as the customers never see or hear of.
Yeah, so much work goes on behind the scenes. And it reminds me, talking about local government, it reminds me of an instance very early on in my local government career where we had black bin bags and we wanted to be forward thinking. So we wanted to include an element of recycled content, we wanted to be really good. But in doing so, it meant that it then failed the specification on tear and resistance. So we, we torpedoed our own specification by trying to be more sustainable.
Well, isn't that one of the issues we find with some of the plastics? The plastics photodegrade. So if you actually have secondary and tertiary plastics involved in a product, they're actually they haven't got the same tensile strength.
Yeah.
But it's been great to get around and to see and hear. And it is that thing that we all have a rather superficial understanding about what goes on, of everything around us. And it's only when you've got a chance to take a step back or a step out of your day job to go and see what's actually happening, to realize it's a lot more complex, it's a lot more involved, and usually it costs a lot more than you anticipate it should. Because without that level of interaction and engagement, it's a bit like, what is it called, Into the Factory, where they actually go into how you make things like chocolate eclairs, McVitie's biscuits, pencils, a pair of Doc Martens. You don't know how these things are made. You just assume it comes in some sort of semi-created permanent state. And it's only when you go into how these things actually come to pass, you realize the level of complexity, engagement, and detail involved and required in the supply chain. And I suppose for us as a sector, how do we take a more active part in that? How do we bring our wares and our knowledge into that space to make better use of those materials?
Yeah, and that sort of links into the whole aspect of the circular economy, doesn't it? And I mean, like I say, you've seen a lot of policy change during your presidential year, and we've got a government now that's set up a circular economy task force, and is in line to produce a circular economy strategy by the autumn. I mean, how do you think that's likely to play out? I'm assuming it's a move that heartens you, as it were, that you feel is, cool, we're heading in the right direction, as much as policy ever does, and you always have that worry about how it might end up in the detail. But as a general transition from talking about resources and waste, do you think we're on the right track there with the UK government?
Again, I think that there is the issue that the UK government is made up of 4 administrations, and the other 3 administrations have got different policy positions on the circular economy and may indeed be further ahead than the English system. However, I think it's really useful and really interesting that the Circular Economy Task Force has been given such a head of steam, and that the English minister, has made such a big play on the importance of the circular economy towards getting to a zero waste society. Was that by 2042? Was that the date?
I think it was.
I'm still fascinated by what a zero waste society is, because it's quite a change from our current perspective. I think the task force will do some really useful and really interesting work, and there's some really high-powered individuals from academia, from industry, from a variety of parallel sectors who are working on that. I know there's not many of them. I think there's 18 or 19, but I think the more work they do, a bit like what I said a minute ago, the more work they do, the more work they'll realize needs to be done. And so I feel that in many regards, this is just the opening of a doorway. And as we get into the overall philosophy of the circular economy and what it means for government across all the different departments, and a big task of this is how to embed circularity beyond just being a DEFRA topic. How to bring it into the Treasury, how to bring it into agriculture, how to bring it into housing. Those are going to be key tasks. And obviously, as those different government departments also address and tackle and grapple with what circularity means, I can see years of individual work on this going ahead. So I think if we are looking at bringing circular economy in, it'll probably be twin-tracked with the aspirations around the climate breakdown and greenhouse gas management, because obviously our rates of consumption then mean that each of our consumptive patterns has got a little plume of carbon attached to it. So if we're going to look at that, the two of these sit quite well together. But it's not a one-hit wonder. It's not that we've got the job done and we're finished by the end of this Christmas. I think that it is just the starting point, and I think there'll be a raft of other different initiatives and interventions, either sectorally down different strands or generically, that need to be addressed.
No, that makes total sense. And I mean, just on that, I mean, obviously, you've mentioned there about obviously that is, whilst it's the UK government, we've got other governments, and obviously yourself coming across from Northern Ireland. Have you found that during your presidential year that there has been the conversations around how the devolved nature of waste policy has sort of unfolded? And is there stuff you've learned that you can take back from Northern Ireland, or perhaps some things that perhaps are happening in Northern Ireland that surprised other people?
Well, I've met one or two of the ministers, and I've been really enthused by how knowledgeable they've been over the course of this year. And they tend to be more seasoned politicians, which is useful, because the art of the possible is what politics is all about.
Yeah.
And to make this stuff happen is going to require some wily political manipulation and creativity to place this on the top table and to keep it on the top table. So I've been heartened by the politicians I've met over the course of the year. I think each of the administrations has got different strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah.
I think the issue is how the administrations can learn one from the other in a way that's supportive and useful, learning from best practice or good practice. And again, this, I suppose, to some extent pushes me into that headspace of being a senior officer in local government at the time of best value. How do we know what good looks like? How do we apply good practice? How do we internalize it and make it work for us in our area to effectively translate from what is a Rolodex of good ideas and good thinking into what actually works in my area at this time with my resource levels? So I think the circular economy provides a lot of that opportunity. And as I mentioned earlier on, I think the issue of critical raw materials is going to be one that really brings it front and center, because it's not so much the critical raw materials themselves that are going to be a problem. It's how they are reprocessed and remanufactured and re-refined. Because at the minute, the majority of that reprocessing, refining process is actually done in China.
Yeah.
So the materials themselves as base metals are mined from all around the world, but China has really got the drop on the rest of the world by having that capacity. So how are we in the UK and more widely in Europe going to invent or reinvent that level of finessing to extract and to represent quality materials for reincorporation to new products?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a concept that we're promoting within CIWM about resource resilience. It's not just collecting the things. It's about how much of it can we keep on these shores, as it were. How much can we reprocess? How much can we put back into the end market ourselves? And it's interesting, actually, when you talked about circular economy just there, you talked about, sort of carbon and net zero and things like that. And there can be a danger sometimes, can't there, that we get focused on carbon, and I wouldn't say forget, but we lose sight of resources and resource use, and they're not always pulling the same way, are they? And I think, especially for our sector and where we're coming from, we would argue you really need that focus on resources, resource use, and being resource resilient.
Well, you're talking about stuff again, aren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the management of stuff, management of materials. And if you have materials already existing, it makes sense to make them last for as long as possible. And when they are no longer able to be used, to make sure you use them in a way that actually maximizes their potential after use. Now, I know across the UK, for example, there's something in the order of 60 incinerators. But when you have got that material that really is at the end of its useful life, its final act can be to produce energy and power.
Yeah.
That's not to say that those facilities will last in perpetuity, because obviously the incineration and waste to energy and energy from waste fleets have got a given time frame. But at the minute, we live in a wasteful society, which we can see by that fire hose of stuff being produced. And any one of us in the waste sector and resources sector will know that we're producing something close to 0.5 ton per person per year. if we're going to be a zero waste society in the next 20 years, we're going to have to transition from where we are now to that waste-less society. In the meantime, we're going to need facilities to do that.
When you put it like that, we've got to go from 0.5 ton of waste each to no tons in the next 20 years. Crikey, that's quite a challenge, isn't it?
Well, if you wanted to look at it purely from the circular economy lens, when we did the review in Northern Ireland of our circular economy strategy, it was recognised that every and each man, woman and child was consuming 16 tons worth of input to create that 0.5 ton of output.
Yeah.
So the aspiration was that by 2050, we would go from 16 tons per person generated globally to 8 tons per person. So we would half our input levels. But that's still 8 tons per person. And in a resource-constrained world, in a contested space world, can we even accommodate that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I suppose
now we're having this. Yeah. This interview is not so far after World Earth Day.
Yeah.
So yeah, the issue for us is how do we recenter some of our thinking? And there is this, it's very exciting. Our mental mind maps have to change.
Yeah.
We are coming to a period of significant, alteration to our existing behaviors, the existing expectations. So what role are we going to play in steering that and influencing that and contributing to those changes? Because the one thing is for sure, we cannot do more of the same and expect a different result.
Yep.
So there's a huge amount around behavioral here as well. Behavioral economics, behavioral thinking, nudge theory, all this stuff. Because ultimately, if we terrorize individuals, if we make it seem as being something that's being done to them, we'll lose them from the get-go. So how do you make this as being much more of a positive? How do we reconnect with what people actually are and how people choose to live their lives? And you hinted it earlier on about that idea of how do we reasset or reassign what it is to be a person and what it is to live in a community and how to be more, of a citizen rather than just being a consumer. So how do we do that? And how do we assist? How do we contribute to? How do we work through what that means? And how do we usefully continue to produce product in that environment that people want?
Interesting, isn't it? I mean, we've touched on some big stuff there, but maybe bringing it down a little, or concentrating it down, not bringing it down. We never want to bring anything down on the podcast, but yeah, in terms of sort of focusing in a bit more. Again, coming towards the end of the presidential year, what have you any sort of hopes or thoughts for the sector, maybe in the near future, in the next year or so, that you'd like to see or you can see moving forward?
Well, what I'd really like to see is the EPR landing and being a success. I'd really like to see the packaging materials, that redistribution of money around the packaging chain being successful and being used as most beneficially it can by the councils to recover additional materials and being invested appropriately. I'd like to see how that influences the actual packaging design and how the packaging producers respond by this redistribution of monies through the supply chain. Because I think that could be very powerful. I think that then raises the spectre about whether there could be other EPR schemes. I did mention earlier on about how I believe personally there should be an EPR scheme for every material placed on the marketplace. But I think the next contender probably is textiles.
Yeah.
And there's a couple of the fast fashion companies that are really, this is not part of their DNA, is that issue about the accompaniment or the apportionment of costs adequately. And as we know, the textile sector and recycling is struggling at the minute because a mixture of markets closing, a mixture of travel disruption, and a mixture of currency disruption is causing them to really, really struggle to maintain the current status quo. So I think that's going to be very interesting space for the next year or two. I think the waste tracking will be really interesting.
Yeah.
As we know, as was revealed over the course of the year, I think something in the region of 18 or 19% of all waste movements in the UK are likely to be illegal. And I think we're all tarred with the same brush around that, because again, on the premise that most people don't focus very much on waste operators, the issue of illegality is a headline piece.
Yes, it is.
And so it's easy just to tar everybody going, you guys are all cowboys. That's not the case at all. There's some really, really good and high aspirational actors in this space. But the reality is, if we're all tarred with that brush, it's not good. So I would like to see waste tracking being introduced in a way that really begins to track materials much better. And that then feeds into that whole issue I mentioned earlier on about having consignment space for materials, so we can store, we can stockpile materials for use later on. DRS, I don't know. I mean, DRS is coming very hot on the heels of EPR, and it could probably do with being pushed out a bit. Let the EPR system really get up and running.
Yeah.
And I was struck in my traveling up and down England in particular about the amount of litter that I saw on the roadsides. And I did wonder, it's something I thought, is there some way there could be a temporary DRS put in place for litter? Imagine if we were to valorize all those items you saw on the roadside and the highway, from tires to bits of car that are broken to endless amounts of clear and flexible plastics. Some way we could do DRS around it? Be really interesting, real challenge. But if you were to give them a value and to give people agency to actually clean up their neighborhood for community gain or personal gain, I think that would be a real game changer, because it would get people to interact with the materials that are discarded.
Yeah.
I was also really struck in my drive about the size of some of what they euphemistically call fulfillment centers. And I went, Jesus, there's the fire hose in operation. Look at the size of that shed. I said, that dwarfs anything we've got in the waste sector.
Yeah, it does.
And that's about pushing stuff into the marketplace, never mind reclaiming stuff off the marketplace. So again, that's what I was saying earlier on about, it strikes me that we're still in this sort of linear headset where there is this channel shift saying, I'm selling you loads of pruck, but ultimately it falls on you as the consumer to do something with that at the end of the day when you've finished with it. It doesn't feel right somehow. And I think that is something that, again, the Circular Economy Task Force will need to grapple with, either this year or probably longer term, because there is that, I've used the phrase a few times, channel shift, that shifting of responsibility from the producer to the user, which doesn't feel, it feels asymmetric. It doesn't feel balanced.
Yeah.
But other things coming down the pipeline, yeah, I think geopolitics, we can't avoid that. That's going to introduce changes that we may not have foreseen around the range of materials, range of products we have at our fingertips, and the prices of those. And likewise, the issue of some of the constituent parts that we take for granted, things around our computers, things around our mobile phones, the chips, etc., that come with them. I think that's all part and parcel of that sort of geopolitical piece. And I think the issue of urgency, I think the issue of policy interventions isn't going to go away, because we're seeing issues around species loss, bug life. They're one of my chosen charities when I was president. Bug life at the minute is saying that the splat index on car windows is going down through the floor. There's been a 55% decrease in bug splat in Northern Ireland since 2020. In the UK, it's 63% since 2020. So given that bugs are our lives, given that they are our pollinators, that's not a good thing.
No.
So, issues around biodiversity, I think, are going to gain credence and credibility, because we rely on these little critters. We rely on the environment around ourselves more than we may choose to recognize. So I think all that is going to come into the fore in the quite near future. And all these targets we had, what was it for 2025? 55% recycling,
Yeah.
60% recycling for 2030. These dates are coming upon us fast.
Yeah.
And yet recycling rates have been stagnating despite all these new policy interventions and to some extent the investment of money through EPR. So it'll be exciting to see, does EPR actually lead to increased tonnage recovery?
Yeah, it will. I mean, phew, I think the sector's got a lot to live up to if it can do that. But then it's the sort of sector that could live up to that sort of thing and deliver those sorts of things. I suppose just to round off, then,
We're practical people.
well,
You know,
exactly. That's
risen
why
to
we keep solving the problems.
we've risen to every challenge that's been given to us for over 100 years.
Yeah.
So, you know, I'm the 108th president after all. So it's not like that we're Johnny come lately. The issue for us is just how do we make our voice heard in a way that is constructive and that our contribution is recognized or appreciated. And that's why I think working through the supply chain and working up the supply chain becomes a critical issue for us, because we have got practical knowledge here. We do know the nature of the materials. We do know the volume of the materials, and we do know the impact of those materials. So it's a matter of, as I said, finding an audience, creating an audience, and creating content for that. So when we're having those discussions, we're speaking with a powerful voice, which is one of our pillars that I've been talking about in the AGMs over the last month or so. Speaking with authority and speaking with knowledge,
which you have done more than eloquently today on the podcast. And just to round off, then, is there something, having done nearly a year now as president, is there something you wish you'd known before you came president that would have been helpful? And I guess, you saying you're the 108th, are there any words of wisdom you would pass on, having done it now, to the 109th, 10th, 11th, 112th president?
I guess the issue is, to take on this role, you have to invest a certain amount of yourself into it, which is great. I mean, it's one of the reasons why people step forward. But there is the recognition that in doing so, you do need to have a bit of bandwidth. You do need to have, an accommodating family and an accommodating organization or institution. So, I'm very grateful for those around me who've allowed me to do this. It does take a bit of time, and I've been graced with and supported by some really good fellow workers and a family, and it's really fun. I have a variety of sort of comments that I've been passing through to yourself and some of your colleagues around how I think there can be better interface between the presidential team, the president itself, and the organization. And I don't suppose that's going to stop. But look, it's been a real privilege and a real honor to have been granted the opportunity to take this on. And to some extent, it does seem to have gone by so fast.
Yeah.
There are peaks and troughs, so there's parts of the years where it's not quite so full on, but then there's other ones where you're kind of going, wow, I turned the calendar over today and I went, that was April? Wow. That just rocketed. It seems it was only a couple of weeks ago, last week, that I was turning it over from March to April, and now it's April to May. So what happened to it? So, but it's good fun. It's good fun, and it's a blast.
Brilliant. And I think, how could we not end it on that note? Tim, thank you very much. It's been a brilliant conversation with you, as always, taking us off in all sorts of directions. But hopefully it's really given people a flavour of, your presidential year, what you're really invested in terms of your presidential report, and also just, your wider thoughts on the sector and where we may be going.
Well, thanks, Lee. And it's always been a joy to speak with you. And as ever, we covered quite a bit of ground, and there were lots of things we could have talked about, but we didn't. But there you go. Exactly.
So thank you very much, Tim. Hopefully you enjoyed that latest edition of the Beyond Waste podcast. If you want to go back and have a look for previous episodes, then have a look on all the normal podcasting sites. And if you're interested in things around CIWM, Tim's report or other reports, then check out the CIWM website. But hopefully we'll see you soon on the next edition of the podcast.